Once upon a time, but not the magical kind, the British countryside with mud and midges kind. Two little girls took a few photographs in their back garden and convinced the world that fairies were real. Not just any world. The world of 1917, where people believed in telegrams, trench warfare, and the unstoppable logic of mustaches. And among those believers was none other than Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the man who invented Sherlock Holmes, the patron saint of, I deduce, this rationally. Yes, the creator of the most logical detective in fiction got bamboozled by children with scissors and cardboard. Welcome, dreamers, to the story of the Cottingley Fairies, the world's most charming hoax. A tale of imagination, innocence, spiritualism, and the occasional poor decision made by geniuses. So grab your cocoa, adjust your pillow, and prepare for a story that's equal parts delightful, ridiculous, and oddly heartwarming. It all began in Cottingley, a sleepy village in Yorkshire, England, the kind of place where time moves slowly, tea is compulsory, and gossip travels faster than the railway. The year was 1917 and the Great War raged across Europe. Britain was weary, rationed, and desperate for a little magic. Enter two unlikely magicians, Elsie Wright, 16 years old, artistic and clever, and her cousin Frances Griffiths, just 9, newly arrived from South Africa with a mischievous grin and a deep curiosity for everything that sparkled. The two girls lived in a quiet house by a stream, a bubbling ribbon of water that wound through the woods behind the Wrights' garden, the kind of place where sunlight filters through leaves and every rustle could, if you squinted hard enough, be something enchanted. Frances and Elsie would spend hours there, returning home soaked and muddy, with the telltale excuse, "We've been playing with the fairies." Now imagine being their parents. It's 1917, you're tired, worried about war, and your children keep insisting they've been hanging out with supernatural beings by the stream. You'd probably sigh, pour another cup of tea and say, "That's nice, dear. Wash your hands for supper." But Elsie's father, Arthur Wright, was not just any father. He was an engineer, a man of reason, and also, inconveniently for the girls, the owner of a camera. A mid-quarter plate camera, to be exact. And so, one sunny afternoon, when Frances complained that no one believed her fairy stories, Elsie had an idea that would change their lives and history. "Let's show them," she said. "We'll take their picture." Now, to a modern audience accustomed to Photoshop, AI filters, and TikTok deepfakes, this might sound innocent. But in 1917, photography was basically witchcraft with a tripod. People trusted photographs. A picture didn't just say 1,000 words, it said, "Look, proof." So the girls borrowed Elsie's father's camera, trudged down to the beck, and disappeared for about 30 minutes. When they returned, Arthur asked how they'd done. "Oh, splendid," Elsie said, dusting off her skirt. "We got them nicely." Few days later, Arthur developed the plate in his darkroom and froze. There, standing in the image, were Frances and, surrounding her, delicate, winged creatures. Not smudges, not tricks of the light, but fairies, tiny, human-like figures, dancing in the air beside her. Arthur stared, then frowned, then muttered something very British like, "Good heavens," and probably wondered if the chemicals had gone off. He showed the photo to his wife, Polly, who was instantly enchanted. "I knew it," she said. "They were telling the truth." Arthur, however, was unconvinced. He wasn't a man given to whimsy. He told the girls off for borrowing his camera and filed the photo away, muttering about double exposures. And that might have been the end of it. A curious family anecdote destined for the attic, if it weren't for one small problem. Polly wouldn't let it go. She believed, truly, that her daughter and niece had photographed real fairies. And in fairness to her, pun absolutely intended, it was a beautiful photo. The fairies looked ethereal, graceful, like little ballerinas caught mid-step. So she took the photograph to a local meeting of the Theosophical Society, a spiritualist group fascinated by the unseen world. And that's where things started to flutter out of hand. Fast forward 3 years. It's 1920, and England is still limping from the war. People are hungry for belief, for wonder, for anything that isn't a ration book or bad news. Enter Edward Gardner, a leading member of the Theosophical Society, who heard about these fairy photographs circulating in Yorkshire. He saw potential, not just for a curiosity, but for proof that the world was more than smoke, mud, and machinery. And Gardner, bless him, was a man of enthusiasm and questionable discernment. When he received copies of the photos, he was awestruck. Authentic, he proclaimed. These are genuine images of nature spirits. He had them analyzed by experts. One of them, Harold Snelling, a photographic specialist, declared, "These are entirely genuine photographs of whatever was in front of the camera," which technically was true. It's just that what was in front of the camera happened to be paper cutouts of fairy illustrations pinned to the ground with hat pins. But Gardner didn't know that. And neither, most crucially, did Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. At the time, Doyle was not only a famous author, but also an ardent spiritualist. After losing his son during the war, he had turned to seances, mediums, and the supernatural for comfort. When Gardner showed him the fairy photographs, Doyle's heart and imagination soared. Here was the evidence he'd been seeking, a bridge between the world of men and the world beyond. He wrote to Gardner, "I am inclined to think that this is a very valuable revelation. It's one of history's great ironies. The man who gave us the cold rationalism of Sherlock Holmes declaring, essentially, 'Yes, Watson, the fairies are among us.' Back in Cottingley, the girls, blissfully unaware that famous men were now studying their handiwork, carried on as normal. But word reached them that their photograph was most convincing, and Gardner, through a local contact, requested more evidence. Elsie and Francis obliged. They borrowed the camera again. This time they posed differently. Francis sat on the grass, gazing at a small, gnome-like figure with a pointy hat. Click. Another masterpiece of imagination. When Arthur developed the second plate, his skepticism deepened. "You'll have to stop using my camera," he said. "You're wasting plates." He didn't realize he was holding the seeds of one of the 20th century's most famous hoaxes. Back in London, Doyle was preparing to publish a piece for the Strand magazine, the same publication that had made Sherlock Holmes a household name. Only this time, instead of crime-solving and deduction, he would be unveiling fairies. Doyle wrote with the same earnest passion he once reserved for Holmes's logic. He praised the girl's sweet sincerity and purity of heart, declaring that such innocence could never deceive. His readers, however, were divided. Some were enchanted. Others muttered that Doyle had gone completely round the twist. The press dubbed it the fairy scandal, and before long, the quiet village of Cottingley became the epicenter of a national frenzy. Photographers, journalists, skeptics, and believers all converged, trying to catch a glimpse of the magical beings by the beck. Meanwhile, Elsie and Francis watched the chaos unfold with the unbothered calm of children who had no idea they'd accidentally fooled half the country. And so, two young girls, one clever, one curious, had conjured a miracle from cardboard and imagination. What began as a playful prank was now a phenomenon involving scientists, spiritualists, and one of literature's greatest minds. The world had seen fairies and believed. But the real magic, the reason this story endures, isn't in the trick itself. It's in how desperately people wanted it to be true. Because in a world recovering from war, maybe a little nonsense was exactly what everyone needed. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was having a strange decade. The man who had once made his fortune writing about logic and deduction was now knee-deep in seances, ectoplasm, and ghostly handshakes. After the death of his son Kingsley during the Great War, something in him shifted. The old confidence that reason could solve anything gave way to a desperate hope that something, anything, might lie beyond the grave. And so, when the photographs of fairies fluttered across his desk, it was as if the universe had whispered directly to him, "You were right to believe." Doyle wasn't a fool. He was just, shall we say, selectively logical. When the subject was footprints or cigar ash, he was a fortress of reason. But when it came to invisible entities dancing in the garden, suddenly he was more open-minded than a door in a hurricane. He studied the photographs carefully, wrote to Gardner and declared them entirely authentic. Finally, proof that the spirit world was real. Not just ghosts and mediums, but an entire ecosystem of invisible beings flitting around the hedgerows. Edward Gardner, equally excited, saw this as a cosmic opportunity. He began touring Britain, giving lectures about the New Age dawning, a time when fairies might be photographed as easily as butterflies. He even sold lantern slides of the Cottingley photos to audiences, declaring them scientifically irrefutable. And the crowd ate it up. After years of death and grief, people wanted enchantment. A small girl smiling at fairies by a brook? That was medicine for the soul. Doyle decided to write about it publicly. In 1920, the Strand magazine announced a special Christmas issue containing a piece by the great author himself, Fairies Photographed, an epoch-making event. Readers expected a new Holmes story. Instead, they got spiritual enthusiasm sprinkled with scientific-sounding sincerity. There is nothing inherently impossible, Doyle wrote, in the existence of fairies. He cited experts, photographic analysis, and the girl's apparent honesty as evidence. They are simple, truthful children, he declared, utterly incapable of deception. Britain went wild. Newspapers debated the fairy photographs like they were matters of state. Half the country thought Doyle had lost his marbles. The other half thought the fairies were about to start applying for passports. The Daily Mail sent reporters to Cottingley. "The fairies are here," shouted one headline. The Wright family's quiet garden became a pilgrimage site for believers, skeptics, and at least one man who tried to sell fairy-detecting glasses. Back in Cottingley, the girls were bewildered. Frances found the attention exciting. Elsie, who was older and had a sharper sense of irony, thought it was all a bit mad. They never meant for anyone to take it seriously. It had been a game. They'd used cutouts from a popular children's book called Princess Mary's Gift Book, drawn little wings on them, and propped them up with hat pins. To them, it was play. To Doyle, it was revelation. And now, their little prank was spiraling into international fame. When Gardner visited them in person in 1920, he arrived like a man on a mission from destiny, dressed impeccably, carrying letters from Doyle himself, and speaking in tones that suggested he was about to unveil the secrets of Atlantis. He met Elsie and Frances, who were polite, demure, and very good at pretending to be shy. Gardner told them the world needed more evidence. Could they perhaps take more photographs? The girls nodded nervously. They could, they supposed. Gardner even brought them new cameras to ensure no trickery. He gave them instructions and fresh plates, left them to their play, and waited. A few days later, the girls returned with 3 new images. Frances leaning toward a fairy, offering her a posy of flowers. Elsie with a dancing fairy on her lap. And finally, a dramatic image of fairy figures in a graceful swirl. Gardner was ecstatic. The photographs were beautiful, whimsical, and utterly implausible. But they felt real. When Doyle received the new set, he declared them conclusive proof. He wrote, "The evidence for the objective reality of fairies is now beyond all reasonable doubt." That sentence, in hindsight, is the literary equivalent of watching a man step happily into a puddle while announcing the weather is fine. But to Doyle, it was divine confirmation. He was already preparing his next great work, The Coming of the Fairies. In London, scientists and skeptics began to take notice. One of them was Major Ronald Proctor, who pointed out that the fairies looked suspiciously like illustrations from popular magazines. Another noted that their hairstyles were distinctly Edwardian. But the spiritualists had an answer for everything. The fairies, they said, appear as the human mind expects them to, which is conveniently what one says when one's evidence is wearing turn-of-the-century ballet shoes. Doyle pressed on. He gave interviews explaining that materialism had blinded mankind. Fairies were a sign that the veil between worlds was thinning. Somewhere, Sherlock Holmes was rolling in his fictional grave. Meanwhile, Elsie's father, Arthur, was becoming increasingly irritated by the attention. He still didn't believe a word of it, and thought the whole affair was bringing unwanted scrutiny to his family. He told the girls to stay quiet and stop making any more pictures. But the ball was already rolling, and it was enormous. There were lectures, pamphlets, debates, even children writing to ask how they could meet fairies too. The story spread beyond Britain. American newspapers reprinted the photographs. A spiritualist journal in Australia claimed fairies were the missing link between humankind and angels. One publication even suggested the fairies might represent the scientific future of vibration energy. If that sounds confusing, it's because it was. The early 20th century was a wild time for pseudoscience and polite delusion. Doyle, feeling vindicated, planned a world tour on spiritual matters. To him, the fairies were part of a broader cosmic awakening. Humanity was evolving. Soon we'd all see beyond the physical plane. You can almost hear Sherlock whispering, "Sir, you're embarrassing me." By now, the girls were in over their heads. They were kind children, not con artists. They didn't dare confess. Who would believe them? Imagine telling the creator of Sherlock Holmes that he'd been fooled by your arts and crafts project. It was unthinkable. So they smiled, nodded, and let the world believe. Each new photograph was taken half in fear, half in mischief, with the hope that maybe, just maybe, people would stop asking questions. But fame has its own gravity. When The Coming of the Fairies was published in 1922, the public reaction was explosive. Critics mocked Doyle relentlessly. Some said he'd lost his rational mind. Others called him noble for defending innocence in a cynical world. Sales were strong, but the damage to his reputation was real. The great detective's creator had become the butt of a national joke. The girls, now teenagers, quietly distanced themselves. Elsie moved on with life, working as an artist. Francis grew up, married, and emigrated for a time. The fairies lingered as a family secret, a thing to chuckle about, then quickly change the subject. But the photographs themselves took on a life of their own. They'd been printed in books, studied by believers, and even displayed in exhibitions. What started as a prank between cousins had become folklore. Decades passed. The fairies faded from public obsession, replaced by newer mysteries, flying saucers, crop circles, men claiming to have tea with Bigfoot. But every so often, the Cottingley story resurfaced, a charming reminder that even in the age of reason, people long for a touch of the impossible. Still, one question lingered. If it was all fake, why didn't they ever confess? What made them hold on to the secret for more than 50 years? The answer, as it turned out, was part fear, part affection, and perhaps just a sprinkle of genuine wonder. Because the thing about pretending long enough is that sometimes you start to believe it yourself. And so the world carried on, half smiling, half shaking its head at the Cottingley Fairies. Doyle had passed on, content that he'd glimpsed another realm. The spiritualists marched on, and the little girls who fooled the greatest detective writer of all time had grown up quietly, leaving behind one of the most delightful deceptions in modern history. By the early 1920s, the Cottingley Fairies had taken on a life of their own, quite a feat for paper cutouts. Across Britain, people argued about them in tea rooms, on trams, and in lecture halls. Were they real? Were they a joke? Was the world going collectively mad? The answer, arguably, was yes to all three. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was still beaming with conviction. He believed he had struck a blow against the dreary tyranny of science. At last, he said, proof that life is more mysterious than the skeptics will admit, which is a lovely thing to believe, until someone points out that your proof is made of stationery. Meanwhile, in Cottingley, the Wright family had grown weary of the endless attention. Strangers sent letters asking for fairy summoning tips. Journalists showed up at the doorstep. One man even tried to bribe the family gardener for soil samples from the enchanted glen. Arthur Wright, who had started this whole thing with his camera, now regretted ever letting his daughter near it. He told anyone who'd listen, "Those photos are nonsense." But when people realized he was the father of the fairy girl, they treated him like a gatekeeper of the spirit world. Poor man couldn't buy tobacco without someone asking if the fairies liked matches. The girls themselves were caught between laughter and guilt. Frances, the younger cousin, still claimed to see fairies by the beck. She wasn't lying, not exactly. To a child, imagination can be as vivid as sight. She'd convinced herself that perhaps something truly magical had happened. Elsie, older and more practical, knew exactly what they'd done, but she kept quiet. Because at this point, confessing would mean admitting they'd made fools of a best-selling author and the entire spiritualist community. It's not easy to raise your hand in a crowd of believers and say, "Actually, we used hat pins." And so the story continued. Doyle wrote essays defending the photographs against skeptics, calling critics materialists incapable of wonder, which is a very polite Edwardian way of saying party poopers. Newspapers printed side-by-side debates between scientists and spiritualists, as though the fairies were up for election. One headline read, "Do you believe in the Cottingley Fairies? Send us your vote." It was Britain's first supernatural opinion poll. But for all the public excitement, there was also a growing undercurrent of doubt. One man in particular, a magician named Harry Houdini, looked at the photographs and raised an eyebrow so high it probably scraped the ceiling. Houdini, the master of illusions, could spot a trick faster than anyone alive. "If these are real," he said dryly, "then I'll eat my own chains." He corresponded briefly with Doyle, which was like watching two planets collide. Doyle adored Houdini, convinced the great escape artist had supernatural powers. Houdini, who had spent his entire career exposing fraudulent mediums, kept telling Doyle, "It's all tricks." Doyle refused to believe him. He wrote lovingly that Houdini possessed psychic gifts he himself did not understand. Houdini replied, "Sir Arthur, I assure you I understand them quite well." It was the politest ongoing argument in history. The Cottingley case fascinated Houdini because it was, in essence, a magician's dream. An illusion so simple and charming that it fooled people who should have known better. If two little girls could bamboozle the creator of Sherlock Holmes, what hope did the rest of humanity have? By 1921, even some spiritualists began to grow uneasy. They wanted to believe, yes, but the fairies in the photos looked suspiciously fashionable. Their hairstyles were neatly bobbed. Their dresses had hems that would have made a milliner proud. One critic said, "They appear to have been to the same tailor as the Wright family." Another quipped that the fairies looked quite modern, for creatures of folklore. A few skeptics noticed the suspiciously two-dimensional look of the wings, but Gardner and Doyle dismissed it as the result of motion during flight, which is a wonderful scientific explanation for paper wobbling in a breeze. Still, the believers marched on. Doyle continued to give lectures about spiritualism, his voice booming with conviction. The fairies, he insisted, were not mere fantasy. They were heralds of a higher truth. Humanity was being invited to glimpse the unseen. He even suggested that fairies were part of a grand cosmic hierarchy, somewhere between humans and angels, which sounds beautiful until you realize it's based entirely on two children's craft project. Meanwhile, the girls grew up. Frances went to school. Elsie found work in a photography studio. A delicious irony. Life returned to normal, except for the occasional journalist who'd appear at the door holding a magnifying glass and far too much enthusiasm. Each time, the family would sigh and say, "No, we haven't seen the fairies lately," and close the door quickly before being dragged into another interview. But the fairies never really went away. They lingered in the public imagination like a pleasant dream you can't quite shake. People wanted to believe, not because the evidence was convincing, but because the idea was comforting. It was nice to think that somewhere in the dull gray world of ration books and coal smoke, There might be tiny dancers hidden in the leaves. Doyle's book, The Coming of the Fairies, made its rounds internationally. It was mocked in some quarters and adored in others. Americans, ever enthusiastic for the strange, published cartoons showing Doyle being carried off by winged creatures holding teacups. French newspapers called it une charmante illusion. Germans, less sentimental, simply said, Nein. As the years passed, Doyle's health began to decline, but he remained steadfast. Until his death in 1930, he truly believed the Cottingley photographs were proof of the unseen world. When he died, admirers wrote that he had gone to meet his fairies, which is either touching or tragic depending on how you look at it. The world moved on. The Jazz Age roared. Wars came and went, and science advanced to the point where people could split atoms, fly across oceans, and eventually land on the moon. But the Cottingley Fairies remained a curious footnote, a reminder that even the most rational age is never immune to the charm of a good story. By the 1960s, most people had forgotten the affair. The photos collected dust in archives. Then one day, a BBC journalist rummaging through old clippings decided to find out what had really happened. The girls, now women in their 60s, were still alive. Frances was living quietly in England again, and Elsie was a retired artist. When asked about the photographs, both smiled the same secret smile they had used as children. "We never meant any harm," Elsie said. "We just wanted to make them believe." The journalist leaned forward. "So it was a joke?" There was a pause. Frances looked thoughtful. "Well," she said softly, "it started as one, which is the kind of answer that doesn't clear anything up at all. And so the mystery lingered, half truth, half memory, entirely delightful. A prank that had grown wings fluttered through history and refused to land. The fairies of Cottingley were by now part of folklore, more famous than the trolls of Norway, more photogenic than Nessie, and infinitely better behaved than the ghosts of any haunted manor. The girls had aged, the world had changed, but the pictures still glowed with that same mischievous innocence. Two young cousins, caught forever in the act of pretending. And the strangest part? Even after decades, even when everyone should have known better, there were still those who believed. Because perhaps deep down, people didn't want to live in a world without a little magic. By the time the 1970s rolled around, the Cottingley Fairies were practically antique. People remembered them the way you remember an old rumor from school, vaguely, fondly, and with the faint suspicion that you might have imagined the whole thing. Britain had moved on. Men were walking on the moon. People were microwaving their dinners, and fairies, if they existed at all, were probably hiding behind shag carpets and lava lamps. And yet, somewhere in Yorkshire, the women who'd started it all were still very much alive, still politely refusing to discuss the most famous photographs in the history of make-believe. Frances Griffiths was now a quiet grandmother living in the English countryside. Elsie Wright, her cousin, was an accomplished watercolor artist who could paint anything, except, apparently, her way out of the world's longest-running prank. They were respectable, pleasant, and gave the distinct impression of women who had better things to do than explain to journalists why a dead novelist once thought they'd uncovered the spirit realm. But in 1971, the fairies fluttered back into the public eye thanks to, you guessed it, a television documentary. The BBC had decided to revisit the mystery for an episode of Nationwide, that delightful British hybrid of news, nostalgia, and mild chaos. The producers tracked down Frances and asked if she'd be willing to talk about the photographs again. To everyone's surprise, she agreed. The nation tuned in to see her. White-haired, gentle, with the same twinkle in her eyes that once belonged to a mischievous 9-year-old girl by the beck. The interviewer leaned forward, clearly thrilled. "Were they real, Miss Griffiths?" Frances smiled. "Well," she said, "they were real to me." Which, as far as answers go, was the verbal equivalent of dropping a smoke bomb and strolling calmly away, the interviewer pressed. "Do you mean you actually saw fairies?" "Oh yes," Francis said serenely. "I used to see them all the time. They were quite friendly." Somewhere, skeptics groaned in unison. When asked about the photographs, specifically, Francis hesitated. "Elsie did most of the drawing," she admitted. "I wasn't very artistic." The interviewer blinked. "Drawing?" But Francis just smiled again, the smile of someone who knows a secret and plans to keep it. The nation was left wondering whether the mystery had just deepened or finally cracked. Of course, the moment the program aired, the press went wild again. Reporters tracked down Elsie, who was now living in the Midlands, and asked for her side. She was less evasive and more weary. "We were young," she said. "It was just Elsie and Francis having a bit of fun." That was as close to a confession as Britain would get for another decade. The trouble was, even as adults, the cousins couldn't quite agree on the details. Francis maintained that one or two of the photographs might have captured real fairies. Elsie insisted they were all fake. The result was an endless loop of polite contradiction that journalists absolutely adored. It was like watching two kindly aunts reenact Inception with tea and biscuits. By the 1980s, the world had grown nostalgic. For its own gullibility, the story was too delicious to let die. In 1983, a Yorkshire magazine finally persuaded both women to tell the full truth, or at least their version of it. Elsie, ever the artist, admitted that the fairies had been drawn and cut out of paper, modeled after illustrations from Princess Mary's gift book, the same wartime children's collection she'd loved as a teenager. "We never thought anyone would believe it," she said. Father was a bit cross, but it was only meant to be a joke. Frances, however, clung to her belief that the last photograph, the one with the dancing fairies in the air, might have been genuine. "You see," she said, "that one was different. We didn't make those." You could almost hear the collective sigh of a century's worth of believers and skeptics alike. Even in confession, the mystery refused to fully die. The women demonstrated how they'd done it. They showed how they'd propped the cutouts with hatpins and posed for the camera, pretending to look astonished while trying not to giggle. They even drew sketches to show the original designs. When the evidence was laid out, it seemed so obvious, so humanly obvious, that no one could quite believe how far it had gone. But then again, that was the charm of it. The hoax wasn't malicious. It wasn't about fame or money. It was the spontaneous invention of two children in a sleepy village, trying to make their world a little more magical. The fact that it had ballooned into an international sensation involving the world's most famous author was just the cherry on the cake of absurdity. When the confessions were finally printed, the public reaction was equal parts laughter and affection. People didn't feel angry, they felt oddly proud. After all, it's not every day your national history includes the time two girls made fairies out of cardboard and convinced Sherlock Holmes. Academics weighed in, as academics do. Some called it an example of collective fantasy during a period of social trauma. Others said it was a folk narrative evolving through media mythology. But everyone, from professors to pub regulars, agreed on one thing. It was the most British hoax ever. Polite, creative, and executed with unwavering manners. Even the tone of disbelief had softened. In a world that had grown cynical and digital, the Cottingley Fairies felt almost wholesome. Compared to government scandals and economic crises, two kids with scissors seemed practically saintly. In interviews, Francis and Elsie both reflected fondly on how it had all unfolded. "We were surprised anyone took it seriously," Elsie said. "It was just a bit of fun." Francis smiled and added, "Maybe it was meant to make people happy." And in a way, it did. Because for a few shining years during and after a terrible war, people looked at those photographs and saw hope. They saw innocence, nature, magic, everything the modern world seemed to be losing. It wasn't just that they wanted to believe in fairies. They wanted to believe in something good. The BBC returned one last time to interview them both together in 1985. Two elderly women now, sitting side by side with teacups and laughter and a shared twinkle of mischief. When asked if they'd ever imagined it would go this far, Elsie chuckled. Not in a million years, she said. Frances added. We didn't even have proper scissors. It was the perfect ending to the most harmless scandal in British history. By then, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle had been dead for over half a century, but his spirit still loomed over the story. Some felt sorry for him, that such a great mind could be fooled so easily. Others thought it made him more human. Here was a man who spent his life writing about reason, only to be undone by his own hope. Perhaps, they said, he wanted to live in a world where fairies really did dance by the stream, and maybe that's not such a foolish thing to want. To understand why the world fell head over heels for the Cottingley Fairies, you have to picture England in 1917, tired, battered, and desperately in need of a miracle. The First World War had torn through everything, families, traditions, and any lingering sense that the universe made sense. People were mourning husbands, sons, brothers, an entire generation gone. So when two little girls said they'd found fairies in a Yorkshire garden, it wasn't just cute. It was medicine. After years of death and horror, who wouldn't want to believe that innocence still lived somewhere, even if it had tiny wings and a penchant for posing dramatically on ferns? The truth is, the Cottingley Fairies weren't. A fluke. They were perfectly timed. Spiritualism was booming. Mediums were hosting seances in drawing rooms, people were photographing ghosts, and the line between science and magic was blurry enough to make even Einstein raise an eyebrow. You could attend a seance in the morning and a physics lecture in the afternoon and see no contradiction whatsoever. Everyone was searching for meaning. The fairies just happened to flutter into the right gap. Not too religious, not too scientific, but just magical enough to feel plausible. And then came Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the cherry on top of the world's most whimsical sundae. Doyle wasn't just famous, he was trusted. If he said the fairies were real, then surely they must be. This was Sherlock Holmes, the man who could deduce your lunch order from the state of your shoes. If Sherlock believed, who were we to argue? In a strange way, Doyle's endorsement gave the fairies credibility they never could have earned on their own. People figured, if he's convinced, there must be something to it. It's the same psychological magic that sells diet pills and NFT art. When someone impressive says it's real, we all squint a little harder and try to see what they see. But there was more to it than celebrity influence. The fairies offered something the modern world was already losing: enchantment. The Industrial Revolution had turned England into a nation of smoke and schedules. Wonder had been traded for efficiency. The forests where fairies once lived were now railway lines and factories. People didn't need fairies to be real. They needed them to be possible. That's the genius of the Cottingley story. It wasn't a hoax in the cruel sense. It was an invitation. Two girls with scissors said, "What if?" And the whole world answered, "Yes, please." Even the skeptics deep down were a little bit charmed. They might have rolled their eyes and muttered about exposure times and compositing, but you could tell, a part of them wanted the fairies to exist. Because if you admit that two kids could make the impossible real, then maybe life itself still had a few surprises left. In post-war Britain, belief in fairies wasn't just whimsical, it was comforting. The same people who'd lost sons in the EAE trenches were now sitting in halls listening to mediums claim to hear voices from the other side. It was all part of a movement toward hope, a way to make death feel less final. And so when Doyle said he had proof that the unseen world was real, it was like a candle lighting up the dark. It's easy for us, a century later, to chuckle and say, how could anyone fall for that? But we're not so different. Our fairies just live on screens now. Conspiracy theories, viral hoaxes, influencer miracles, and Photoshop illusions. We still crave wonder. We just scroll for it instead of developing it in a dark room. The Cottingley Fairies hit that sweet spot between innocence and longing. They didn't threaten science, they danced around it. They weren't ghosts or demons, nothing sinister, just playful and pretty. A bit of light in the shadows. It's no wonder people wanted them to be real. And Doyle, bless him, was the perfect vessel for the collective yearning. He'd already lost so much: his son, his brothers, friends. The fairies weren't just proof of magic to him. They were proof that there was more. More than the mud and the grief. More than what he could see. There's something heartbreakingly human about that. But there's also comedy, of course, because imagine the scene. An Edwardian drawing room filled with intellectuals, earnestly discussing whether the fairies' wings were vibrational energy forms, while the real explanation sat in a kitchen drawer somewhere labeled "Old photographs do not bend." People even formed committees to study the pictures. Experts used magnifying glasses, rulers, and the latest optical theories. Nobody thought to just ask the girls how they did it, because, well, children don't outsmart adults. That would be ridiculous. Yet that's exactly what made the whole thing so delicious. The hoax worked because it came from innocence. Nobody suspected deceit from two Yorkshire girls in pinafores. If it had been two grown men from London, people would have sniffed a trick immediately. But children? They're supposed to be pure, honest, incapable of deception, which, as any parent will tell you, is adorable nonsense. When Doyle wrote about the fairies, he described the girls as having the frank faces of honesty. And he was right. They did look honest. Because they were. They weren't trying to scam anyone, they were playing. The world was the one that decided to take the game seriously. The Cottingley Fairies became the mirror of human desire. We saw in them what we wanted to see. Some saw proof of the afterlife. Others saw a symbol of innocence. Skeptics saw gullibility. The girls, meanwhile, saw a joke that had gone spectacularly out of hand. And yet, somehow, the whole saga feels strangely uplifting. It's a hoax, yes, but it's also a love letter to imagination. Two kids, a camera, and the belief that the world could still surprise you. That's not cynicism. That's art. Maybe that's why, even after they confessed, people didn't feel betrayed. Because deep down, everyone knew it had never really been about the fairies. It was about hope. The same fragile, stubborn hope that makes us tell stories in the first place. If you zoom out far enough, it's almost poetic. Two little girls trying to make adults believe in magic again. And succeeding. Not bad for a prank pulled beside a Yorkshire stream. The Cottingley Fairies didn't just flutter out of the headlines and vanish. They quietly tucked themselves into the corners of British culture, where all the best myths go to nap for a while. You'd be surprised how many people, artists, writers, spiritual seekers, even movie producers, caught a glimpse of those paper-winged creatures and thought, yes, that's exactly what I've been looking for. Because if there's one thing myths are good at, it's reincarnation. They never really die, they just change outfits. In the decades that followed, the fairies resurfaced in the oddest places. A generation of writers grew up hearing about them as children, half believing, half laughing. They appeared in magazines, in school books about British curiosities, even in exhibitions on the history of photography. Somewhere between Stonehenge and Bigfoot, they had earned a permanent seat in the Museum of Collective Imagination. Artists adored them. Painters recreated the Cottingley scenes with dreamy watercolor washes and better anatomy. Poets wrote verses about innocence tricking wisdom. One playwright turned the story into a gentle comedy, where Doyle himself appears as a tragicomic figure, the ultimate believer who just wanted the world to sparkle again. The fairies became shorthand for that fragile moment when imagination outruns reason and wins. And then came Hollywood, which can smell nostalgia from 3 time zones. In 1997, a film called Fairy Tale, a true story, fluttered into cinemas. It retold the Cottingley saga with sweeping music, soft lighting, and a very sympathetic Conan Doyle played by Peter O'Toole, who could make reading a phone book sound mystical. The movie blurred the line between fact and fantasy until the audience walked out thinking, wait, were they real after all? Exactly the same confusion that had powered the story since 1917. Pop culture couldn't resist them. The fairies appeared on book covers, in fantasy art calendars, and, because this was the late 20th century, even in New Age crystal shops. You could buy Cottingley Fairy oracle cards that promised spiritual guidance from the same imaginary creatures that once fooled the creator of Sherlock Holmes. That's not irony. That's poetry with a marketing budget. Meanwhile, scholars began to take a second look. Folklorists pointed out that the Cottingley episode wasn't just a quirky hoax. It was the moment Victorian fairy lore met modern media. For centuries, fairies had lived in oral tales and twilight superstition. The camera dragged them, blinking, into the industrial age. Photography had always claimed to capture truth. Now it was being used to stage dreams. The result was part art, part prank, and entirely revolutionary. In a way, Elsie and Francis were pioneers of visual storytelling. They created what we'd now call a viral image. The first meme, if you like, though with fewer cats and far more hatpins. Think about it. They made something whimsical, believable enough to share, and emotionally resonant enough that millions of people talked about it. That's basically the internet, a century early, just slower and with more tea breaks. And of course the media learned a valuable lesson from the affair. Sensational stories sell. Newspapers realized that wonder was profitable. A photo of fairies could move more copies than 100 articles about Parliament. That discovery never went away. Every UFO sighting, every Loch Ness monster captured on film, headline owes a little debt to the Cottingley girls and their cutout companions. The spiritual movement, too, clung to the fairies as proof that their beliefs weren't absurd. In the 1920s and 30s, countless pamphlets, lectures, and even sermons cited the Cottingley photos as evidence of elemental life forms. The irony was delicious. Two children had given an entire faith movement a set of holy relics printed on photographic paper. But the legacy didn't stop there. As time passed, the fairies began to symbolize something bigger than gullibility or charm. They became an emblem of creativity itself, proof that imagination can outsmart authority. Every art student who's ever faked confidence in front of a critic, every filmmaker who's ever said, "We'll fix it in post," is spiritually descended from Elsie and Francis. And there was something democratic about their hoax. It wasn't crafted by experts or institutions. It was made by two working-class girls in a small village, with nothing but curiosity, scissors, and a camera. In a world dominated by scientists and statesmen, that was quietly revolutionary. For once, the magic didn't come from a laboratory or a throne. It came from kids messing about in the backyard. People admired that spirit long after the truth was known. Even when everyone accepted the fairies were fake, the story still felt oddly inspiring. It said that imagination could change the world, or at least embarrass a famous author. And really, both are noble goals. In art schools, students studied the photographs as examples of composition and tone. In sociology classes, professors used them to discuss mass belief. And in pub conversations across Britain, people retold the story with affectionate disbelief. "Remember when Doyle fell for those fairies?" they'd say, shaking their heads with a grin. It became folklore about folklore. Somewhere along the way, the Cottingley Fairies stopped being a hoax and started being a parable. Not about gullibility, but about yearning, the human need to find magic, even in a world of smoke and mud. Every era gets the fairies it deserves. The Victorians had Tinkerbell and moral allegories. We got Photoshop and UFO TikToks. But the hunger is the same. If you stand by a quiet stream today, you can almost picture it. Two girls giggling, arranging their paper sprites, completely unaware that they're rewriting the boundaries between fantasy and reality. They're not just playing. They're reminding us what belief feels like before the world teaches us better. And maybe that's why the Cottingley story endures. It's not about whether fairies exist. It's about whether we still do. The parts of us that imagine, pretend, and hope. The parts that can look at a piece of cardboard with wings and think, maybe, just maybe. So yes, the Cottingley Fairies influenced art and culture, but their greatest creation wasn't the photos. It was that feeling of suspended disbelief that makes us pause, smile, and wonder, if only for a heartbeat. They gave the world permission to daydream again. Not bad for a couple of kids with a borrowed camera and too much imagination. By the 21st century, the Cottingley Fairies had officially outlived everyone who ever took them seriously. Conan Doyle was long gone. Elsie and Francis had passed quietly into history. But the fairies, the fairies refused to die. They'd traded Yorkshire streams for museum glass cases and the occasional documentary reenactment. Every few years, someone somewhere decided it was time to dust off the story again, polish it up, and show it to a new audience like a slightly eccentric family heirloom. "You've got to see this," people say. "It's mad, it's adorable, it's history." And sure enough, the photographs still have a kind of charm that's impossible to kill. Look at them today, black and white, slightly grainy, the girls staring solemnly while a fairy pirouettes in midair, and you can't help but smile. Not because you believe it, but because you want to. It's the visual equivalent of being told once upon a time. The story's modern revival began quietly, as most resurrections do, with the collectors and the historians. The original, glass plate negatives surfaced in the 1980s and 1990s, tucked away in boxes that had outlasted the century. Museums got involved. Of course they did. Nothing says national treasure quite like a perfectly preserved piece of nonsense. The National Science and Media Museum in Bradford ended up acquiring the photographs and the camera that had started it all. They displayed them lovingly, as if they were relics from a gentler kind of madness. School children filed past, staring at the famous images that had once fooled the great Sherlock Holmes himself. And somewhere in the corner you can imagine a curator whispering, "Yes, they're fake, but aren't they wonderful?" Documentaries followed, each one lovingly titled something like "The Girls Who Fooled the World," or "Fairies, Frauds, and Photograph Plates." The BBC, of course, could never resist a good Yorkshire mystery, so the fairies fluttered across the screen again, accompanied by plinky piano music and interviews with soft-spoken historians who said things like, "It tells us so much about belief." The internet gave the fairies a second wind. Suddenly, anyone could stumble upon the photos online and fall down a rabbit hole of blogs, conspiracy forums, and aesthetic Pinterest boards labeled vintage whimsy. A new generation of believers emerged, people who claimed that Elsie and Francis might have lied about lying. Because, as every modern mythologist knows, the fastest way to make people believe something again is to tell them it's been debunked. There are still message boards dedicated to fairy phenomena, and you'll find threads where users debate quite seriously whether the Cottingley girls might have captured energy beings. Others point out that the photographs could show elementals vibrating at a higher frequency, which sounds suspiciously like something invented by someone with too much coffee and Wi-Fi. Then there are the art fans, who don't care about authenticity at all. They just love the look, the dreamy old-fashioned atmosphere. The Cottingley Fairies have become a staple of cottagecore and fantasy aesthetics. Instagram filters try to mimic that ethereal softness, as if we're all secretly hoping to catch a fairy photobombing our picnic. Even academics haven't let it go. Entire PhDs have been written on the case. Titles like Imagination and the Camera. The Cottingley phenomenon as cultural resistance sound grand, but they all circle back to the same truth. The hoax endures because it's irresistibly human. And there's something poetic about how it's come full circle. The original fairies were born from photography, a new technology used to create wonder. 100 years later, we're doing the same thing with digital art and deepfakes. Technology changes, the dream doesn't. We still use our gadgets to conjure illusions, just fancier ones. In 2017, for the centenary of the first photographs, Cottingley itself hosted a small exhibition. Locals came together to celebrate the story that had put their quiet village on the map. There were lectures, costume contests, and, because this is Britain, an alarming number of fairy-themed cupcakes. Children dressed as sprites, adults dressed as Conan Doyle, and everyone smiled like they were in on the joke, which by now they absolutely were. It's a wonderful thing, really. What started as a private prank between cousins has turned into a century-long communal wink, a national bedtime story told with affection rather than embarrassment. People don't ask, how could they believe this anymore? They ask, isn't it lovely that they did? Even modern filmmakers keep circling back. There have been animated adaptations, fantasy retellings, and even stage plays that explore what the fairies meant to different generations. Some focus on the innocence of the girls, others on the gullibility of Doyle. A few go deeper, suggesting the fairies were metaphors for imagination itself, a rebellion against the hard edges of modern life. And then, every so often, someone new discovers the photographs for the first time. Maybe it's a teenager scrolling through history memes or a tired adult who stumbles on a random YouTube thumbnail labeled, "When Sherlock Holmes Believed in Fairies." They click, they watch, they laugh, and by the end, they feel that peculiar warmth that only a good story gives you. The Cottingley Fairies still work their quiet magic even now. Not because we think they're real, but because we remember what it felt like to believe. The laughter and the wonder are all part of the same spell. Somewhere out there, in a digital archive, the original photographs still rest. Paper wings, porcelain faces, a bit of Yorkshire sunlight frozen forever. And maybe that's the real miracle. Against all odds, a hoax meant to amuse a family has outlasted the entire century that birthed it. Elsie and Francis never got rich or famous from their prank. They didn't even seem to want the attention. But what they created was something far rarer, a myth that refuses to fade, a story that sneaks into each new generation, smiling, whispering, "Don't be too clever, there's still room for wonder." And maybe that's the secret. The fairies never existed, but the magic they sparked never stopped existing either. It just changed form, as all good stories do. And so, after more than a century, the Cottingley Fairies have earned their rest. Not vanished, not exposed, just gently retired, like two mischievous spirits who finally decided they'd had enough fun. Their paper wings have gone still, their tiny cutout faces preserved behind museum glass. Yet somehow they still flutter in the imagination, refusing to behave like ordinary lies. Most hoaxes die when they're revealed. This one didn't. It just smiled, curtsied, and kept on dancing. It's funny, isn't it? Two children in a Yorkshire village playing near a stream, bored one afternoon. And because of them, the world argued for decades about whether magic was real. Politicians come and go. Empires crumble. Technology outpaces itself every 5 minutes. And yet we're still whispering about a couple of cardboard fairies. If that's not immortality, I don't know what is. There's something wonderfully poetic about how it all turned out. The girls grew old, the photographs yellowed, and the world that once believed in sprites and seances now believes in algorithms and influencers. But at its heart, nothing really changed. We still fall for beautiful illusions. We still share stories that make us feel less alone. We still want to think the universe might every now and then wink back. Maybe that's what Doyle was chasing. Not proof of fairies, but proof of kindness in the cosmos. After seeing so much death and loss, he wanted the world to still be tender, playful, enchanted. He wanted to think there was something gentle waiting just beyond the veil. And if it took a hoax to remind people of that, well, perhaps that's the kindest hoax ever told. The Cottingley Fairies weren't cruel or greedy or even deliberate. They were born of curiosity, the same spark that built telescopes and wrote sonnets. Two girls looked at the grown-up world and thought, "You all take yourselves far too seriously." And then, with scissors and a borrowed camera, they gave the world a reason to laugh again. That laughter, perhaps, is their real legacy. The kind that bubbles up when you realize the joke's on everyone, and somehow everyone's in on it. Over the years, people have tried to decide what lesson the fairies left behind. Some say it's a warning about gullibility. Others call it a celebration of imagination. But maybe it's simpler than that. Maybe it's just a reminder that wonder doesn't have to be true to be valuable. A story can be false and still make the world a bit softer, because that's what stories do. They trick the logical parts of our brain into falling asleep long enough for the dreaming parts to wake up. And in that sense, Elsie and Francis were early dreamers. The original sleepy dreamers, you might say. nudging the world toward bed with a gentle, mischievous grin. Close your eyes. Their photographs seem to whisper. Pretend, just for a while. Even now, if you visit Cottingley, the stream is still there. The water still murmurs under the bridge, and the sunlight still filters through the trees in that quiet Yorkshire way. And if you listen closely, you might hear laughter. Not ghostly, not eerie, just the kind of laughter that comes from two cousins who know they've pulled off something extraordinary. Maybe you'll imagine the fairies too. Paper thin, smiling, caught forever in the golden haze between mischief and magic. You'll know they aren't real, of course. But maybe, just maybe, you'll smile anyway, because belief isn't always about evidence. Sometimes it's just about permission. Permission to see beauty where others see nothing. Permission to keep a little of your childhood tucked away, like a secret you refuse to outgrow. And that's what makes the Cottingley Fairies so enduring. They remind us that imagination, even when it deceives, still tells the truth about us, about our need for wonder, our appetite for awe, our refusal to let the world be ordinary. So as you drift off tonight, yes, you, the listener, remember this. The fairies were never the point. The girls were. The story was, the laugh was, the dream was. And in that dream, the world is still wild and full of magic. A place where two kids can make cardboard fairies come alive. And 100 years later, someone halfway around the world is still smiling about it. And really, isn't that the most charming hoax of all? This has been the Cottingley Fairies, the world's most charming hoax, told by Sleepy Dreamer in America. Good night, and may your dreams be slightly suspicious, mildly enchanted, and absolutely full of wonder.